Did you hear about the vegan restaurant that burned to the ground?
No.
Everything melted but the cheese.
That's a question I have later.
G'day folks, and welcome back to Giving What We Can, where we explore how to use our resources to do the most good. This week I'm joined by Bruce Friedrich, the founder and CEO of the Good Food Institute. The Good Food Institute is a non-profit organisation who are working to create a sustainable, secure and just food system by transforming meat production. Since founding in 2016, they've been instrumental in the growth of alternative proteins. In this episode, Bruce provides an overview of the plant-based and cell-based meat industry, the scale of the problems with our current food systems, and what we can do to help. So without further ado, here's Bruce.
Thank you so much for joining us, Bruce. And can you tell us about yourself and in particular GFI and its mission?
Well, thank you very much, Luke. I am honored and delighted to be chatting with you. So Bruce Friedrich, I'm the founder of the Good Food Institute. GFI is founded on the basis of the observation that the wealthier an economy becomes, the more meat the people in that economy are going to eat. Even in the United States and Europe, per capita meat consumption is very high. In the United States, it's the highest it's been in recorded history. And this is despite the fact that people understand the external costs. So it's really hard to be, somebody who pays attention to the news and doesn't know about things like the adverse environmental consequences, the health consequences, the animal protection consequences of the way that we produce meat. But that just doesn't figure in to people's diet choices for the most part. So the Good Food Institute was set up essentially to answer the question, how do we feed close to 10 billion people by 2050 without lighting the planet on fire, essentially. So the way that we focus tends to be on the meat industry's adverse impact on climate, on biodiversity, on antibiotic resistance, and on pandemic risk. And our goal is to convince the biodiversity and climate and global health communities that 70 to 100% more meat by 2050, which is what the UNFAO predicts, is a huge problem for the areas that they care about, and that alternative proteins probably the most tractable, maybe the only tractable solution to the problem.
Yeah, amazing. You've given us a few numbers there that represent the scale in those areas. Are there any other numbers for other relevant areas that really strike you about the scale of the problem?
Sort of the super distilled. So 20% of climate impact is animal agriculture, and yet it gets probably 1/100th of a percent of the NGO attention as a solution to the climate problem. It gets almost no public research dollars, almost no government incentives for private sector activity. As a solution to the climate problem, it's actually even bigger than the 20% of direct emissions represented by animal agriculture. There was a paper in Nature Sustainability last year. It said, so we use about 4 billion hectares of land globally for food production. About 3 billion of those hectares are used for animal agriculture. So that's the size of China plus India times 2 plus Indonesia. And if we simply allow that land to rewild, natural carbon sequestration gets you 26 gigatons of carbon sequestration annually from allowing that land to rewild. So the IPCC is saying without natural carbon sequestration, we don't get to Paris. It's also true that without decreased meat consumption, we don't meet our obligations under the Paris Climate Agreement. And this is like the UNFAO is saying 70 to 100% more meat by 2050. This is the only way that doesn't happen. And similarly, there are a lot of ways that we could do carbon sequestration, but naturally occurring carbon sequestration, this is probably the most tractable. And you're looking at literally like the global output of CO2 equivalent is somewhere on the order of just north of 50 gigatons per year. This is literally sequestering half of that by making this sort of a transition. So that also gets you biodiversity. On the antibiotic resistance front of the antibiotics produced by the pharmaceutical industry, about 70% of them are fed to farm animals. You shift to alternative proteins, you can eliminate the use of antibiotics in animal product production. It's already killing 1.3 million people per year. By 2050, it's going to be 10 million people per year. The UK government says it's a more certain threat to humanity than climate change. And then on pandemic risk, the UN Environment Program, in July 2020, they released a report called Preventing the Next Pandemic. They listed the 7 most likely causes of the next pandemic. And the first one was increased animal product consumption. 70 to 100% more animals by 2050 means 70 to 100% more potential vectors for the next pandemic. The second of the 7 that they listed was industrial animal farming, both because A, you're creating these clone animals with depressed immune systems because they're all biologically almost identical, all the chickens. They're not the vast variety of breeds that you get with heritage breeds. It's just, one. And these genetic clone animals, whether chickens, pigs, or cattle, have much lower resistance to disease. And then you cram 50,000 broiler chickens into a shed or hundreds of thousands of egg-laying hens into a shed. They already have depressed immune systems. And then you cram them together in these filthy conditions, just absolute disease breeding grounds. The fourth issue is encroachment on wildlife habitats. All of the extra land required for animal agriculture encroaches on wildlife habitats. The 7th is climate change. We just covered that. So the first 2, you literally eliminate by shifting to alternative proteins. And you think about something like pandemic risk. COVID-19 was not a particularly deadly pandemic. It was also not a particularly transmissible pandemic relative to what might have been. And yet it sent 150 million people into extreme poverty. So all of the issues we're talking about, climate change, most adversely impacts the people who can least adapt to it and the people who contributed the least to it. The end of working antibiotics is the end of modern medicine. The end of modern medicine, that's super bad for you and me. That is literally death for people in developing economies. The next pandemic, 150 million people, all in developing economies, just sent into extreme poverty because of pandemic risk. So for people who care about the global south, for people who care about the global poor, this is really sort of house on fire stuff. And it's largely ignored by the global health, the climate, and the biodiversity communities.
So you've covered off quite a number of really important, pressing global issues, but your route to this actually started on another global issue. Can you talk about how you got to where you are and now working in the food systems and your animal welfare history there as well?
Yeah, so I actually adopted a vegan diet about 34 years ago after I read the book Diet for a Small Planet. And Diet for a Small Planet, the thesis, the issues that Francis Moore Lepay cares about in that book are very much the how do we feed, at that point, I don't know what the population prediction was, but how do we feed a growing population in a way that is less environmentally unconscious and in a way that doesn't steal resources from the global poor? Because if you have to grow 9 calories of crops to feed them to a chicken to get 1 calorie back out, or 40 calories of crops to feed them to cattle to get 1 calorie back out, that drives up the price of cereals and it leads to global starvation and global poverty. So that was the sort of thesis of the book that turned me vegan originally. And I was running a homeless shelter and a soup kitchen in inner city Washington, D.C., which I did for about 6 years in the early 90s. And I read a book by the Reverend Dr. Andrew Lindsay called Christianity and the Rights of Animals. And Lindsay basically posits, he's an Anglican theologian and Anglican priest and professor of religion at Oxford. And he basically posits that other animals feel pain in the same way that human beings do. They feel pain to the same degree that we do, and God cares about them. And I am a Roman Catholic. And this soup kitchen and shelter that I was running was a Catholic worker soup kitchen and Catholic worker shelter. So sort of a lay Catholic movement focused on Matthew 25, the works of mercy, was what I was doing. And this just really spoke to me incredibly. So I started all of my friends in sort of the Catholic social justice movement, talking with them about the idea that how we're treating animals is a moral issue, and what's happening to them on modern farms, what's happening to them in slaughterhouses is basically, God designs animals to breathe fresh air, and God designs animals to love their young. Jesus talks about a hen's love for her brood, and what we're doing to them on these modern farms and in these slaughterhouses. I mean, it's basically, it's a denial of God to treat these animals so abusively. So I did a bunch of years in animal protection. And part of what I was focused on in animal protection was basically making, these arguments. So I started at People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals in 1996 and worked there for about 13 years. And then I took a 2-year break and went and taught in inner city Baltimore through Teach for America. And then I moved into animal welfare work at a group called Farm Sanctuary. And then I founded GFI. And the founding of GFI was basically just an observation that where food is concerned, and actually like the goal of transitioning the world off of consuming animals wasn't even working in developed economies. And when we think about 70 to 100% more meat by 2050, like most of that is going to be in developing economies where even if the sort of moral suasion arguments worked in developed economies, and they work for a lot of people, right? So it's important and it's valuable. And the people who, run Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods and Upside Foods, like it was the moral arguments that caused them to found their companies. So the moral arguments are important. The conversations are important. The education is important. But even in the US, per capita meat consumption in 2020 was the highest it's been in recorded history until 2021, when it was higher. Even in Europe, per capita meat consumption is extremely high. It seems very unlikely if the external costs and the cruelty and the environmental harm and everything else, if that were going to convince people to change in a big way, we would see it. And we'd still be wondering, how do we do that in rural China? How do we do that where most of this 70 to 100% meat by 2050, where that's happening? So the focus of GFI is basically to say, we're going to work with human nature rather than against it. And we're actually going to produce products from plants that biomimic the meat experience with plants, or actual animal meat, which we can cultivate directly from cells. So take a seed from a plant and you bathe the seed in nutrients and the plant sprouts. Here you take a cell from a chicken or a pig or a fish or a cow and you bathe the cell in nutrients and the cells multiply and grow. So very analogous to what it looks like to grow plants, except that we're doing it with cells. And all of the inefficiency of growing crops to feed them to animals so that we can eat animals, you're just growing the cell directly without any of the bits you don't want and without all of the inefficiency of growing an entire live animal.
It must have been amazing being the ground floor of a lot of these changes. Can you walk me through the experience going from doing work that seemed quite adversarial to big corporates trying to change hearts and minds to trying to change the options that are available and the actors involved and how they have changed during this last decade or so?
Yeah, so I was looking at what was happening with Impossible Foods and Pat Brown, with Beyond Meat and Ethan Brown, in relation to Pat Brown, and Hampton Creek Then, now Eat Just, with Josh Tetrick and Josh Balk. And I've been really good friends with Josh Tetrick and Josh Balk for decades. I met Ethan soon after he founded Beyond Meat. Another close personal friend of mine is the chef Tal Ronan, who I've known for probably 25 years, and he runs Crossroads, founded Crossroads Restaurant in LA, but he's also on the board of both Kite Hill, which is Pat Brown's plant-based cheese company, and Impossible Foods. And the conversations I was having with these guys were very much pointed in the direction of, we have been trying to beg people to eat less or no meat for decade after decade after decade. And we're convincing a lot of people, but it's not actually making a dent in even per capita meat consumption, let alone gross meat consumption. And so, people like Pat and Ethan and Josh and Tal, what they're saying is, look, meat is made up of lipids, aminos, minerals, and water. That is all meat is. And up until those companies, the assumption was that we could make plant-based products for vegetarians and vegans. And where these products came from, if it was wheat protein, it was the waste product, essentially, of pasta and bread. If it was soy protein, it was the waste product, essentially, of soy oil. And the idea was we'll cram the protein together and we'll force vegetarians and vegans to eat it. Like,
being on the receiving end of that.
Yeah, me too. And for me, if you're a vegetarian or a vegan, it's like, cool, I've got something that's burger-like that I can, take to family, gatherings. It's a burger. But the brainstorm of people like Pat and Ethan and Josh and Tal is we can actually biomimic the entire meat experience using plants. So we can hire tissue engineers and meat scientists and plant biologists and mechanical engineers and chemical engineers. Pat Brown is a tenured professor of chemical engineering at Stanford University. We can get the scientists together and we can create the precise meat experience. We can create something that is indistinguishable from the vantage of a meat eater. And because it is so much more efficient, so it's not only it takes 9 calories into a chicken to get 1 calorie back, or it takes 40 calories out of a cow to get 1 calorie back. You're growing those crops, you're shipping them to a feed mill, you're operating a feed mill, you're shipping the feed to the farm, you're operating the farm, you're shipping the animals to the slaughterhouse, you're operating the slaughterhouse. It's multiple extra energy-intensive and polluting factories. It's multiple extra gas-guzzling, pollution-spewing vehicles, and that's bad for the environment, but it's also vastly inefficient. So we've been doing this inefficient system basically for 12,000 years. And the argument of GFI is that it's time for an update. And just like, this is a phone, even though it doesn't have a cord, and this is a camera, even though it doesn't have analog film, meat is the experience of meat, and we can make meat from plants. And then for people, and we're convinced there are a lot of them, for people who want actual animal meat, we can cultivate actual animal meat directly from cells. And because both of these processes are so much more efficient, as they scale up, we should be able to get to a place where the products taste the same or better, and they cost the same or less. And that's kind of the central brainstorm. And for me, the question was, well, do I want to form a company? I very much don't want to form a company. Is there room for a nonprofit organization in this space? And I spent probably 5 months having deep conversations with those guys and lots of other people to try to figure out, is there room for a nonprofit? And the answer is yes. What does the nonprofit do? And just like there's room for lots of environmental nonprofit organizations that are catalyzing the shift to renewable energy and electric vehicles and other, sort of market-based solutions. Similarly, not only is there room for one nonprofit, but the entire environmental NGO and global health NGOs that care about things like antibiotic resistance and pandemic risk, they should all be completely all in on alternative protein policy. So that's a big focus of what GFI is trying to do.
Yeah, so GFI seems to work across quite a number of areas. It would be great if you could unpack that for us.
Yeah, it was really fun to see. So Bill Gates spun out Breakthrough Energy from Breakthrough Energy Ventures in February of last year, so February of 2021. And he produced this book, How to Avert a Climate Disaster. And in How to Avert a Climate Disaster, he says there are 3 legs of the tech climate stool. And it was pretty awesome because that's what we started. I started working on GFI in 2015, created the first sort of strategic plan in the middle of 2016, and we had the 3 legs that Gates, identifies 6 years later. The first one is science. So until GFI came along, nobody had said, what is the technological readiness of these technologies? So you had companies like Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat actually producing the products, but all of their science was protected either by IP or by trade secrets. So the first thing we did was hired scientists and said, what is the technological readiness of plant-based meat and cultivated meat? And on the cultivated meat side, is this viable? Is this science or is this science fiction? Is this ever actually going to happen? Because GFI was originally and still is agnostic on technology. And if we thought cultivated meat was not viable, we'd go off and do something else. So the first thing we do is science. And we have one of the things I'm most excited about in our science program is our alternative protein project, Alt Protein Project. It's basically our chapter project. We have 16 university chapters called the Alt Protein Project. We'll have 32 by the end of this year. And they are designing courses and they are getting professors excited. So anybody who is a tissue engineer or a biotech expert or a plant biologist or a meat scientist, we want them to know that they can help us save the world by dedicating their vocational career to alternative proteins. We also fund a bunch of science. We publish a lot of scientific papers. That's our science department. The plurality of GFI's team members around the world are scientists. Our second leg of the stool is policy, and our global battle cry is that governments should be putting billions of dollars into both A, open access science, so they should be putting billions of dollars into research, and then B, private sector incentives. So the same thing governments have done for renewable energy and electric vehicles, they should be doing for alternative proteins and drug development, for that matter, on the global health side. And that's kind of our battle cry. And globally, Like that is what we are most focused on making happen. And the science and the industry work really sort of feeds into the governments should be making this happen. And we've met with a fair bit of success all over the world on that. We also do things to level the playing field. So fighting for fair labeling regulations, working on cultivated meat safety issues to make sure that it meets with regulatory approval, but that regulatory approval is robust from a health standpoint. And then our third programmatic area, which was kind of what GFI was founded on, is corporate engagement. And when GFI started, what we thought we were going to be is sort of a nonprofit incubator / accelerator. So the founding vision was let's create a lot more Beyond Meats, Impossible Foods, Upside Foods, which was then Memphis Meats and companies like that. And we still do quite a bit of that, but of like, I guess just north of 150 people globally, we have 2 people who are working on that. So on the industry front, we do everything from helping potential entrepreneurs figure out the white space for the company that they're going to start. We have a network of entrepreneurs and investors. We produce a lot of investor resources, a lot of entrepreneur and startup resources. And then we also work with the really big food and meat companies because we're trying to make this a transition rather than a disruption. And we're a couple of years into GFI where we realized that actually it would be flippin' lovely to have JBS and Tyson and Cargill and the other big meat companies and ADM and Nestle and the other big food companies seeing this as opportunity rather than threat, both because if they see it as opportunity, they won't be against it. And if they see it as opportunity, like they define food, they define meat. They have supply chains. They know what customers want. Like getting them on board is going to be just fantastically valuable. It's also fantastically valuable for the startups because, the idea of starting a startup is you will have an exit. Either that's IPO or you sell. Who better to sell to than, a major meat or a major food company? So those are the 3, pillars of what it is that we're working on. And we do a ton of stuff across all of that, including monthly webinars. One of them is the business of alt proteins. The other is the science of alt protein. And we publish lots of papers and those sorts of things.
I'd really love to press into the transition and the way that these quite large existing incumbents are viewing this space.
Yeah, that's been the thing that I at least have been most surprised by is the degree to which all of the major food companies in the world and all of the major meat companies in the world, so the 5 biggest meat companies are JBS, Tyson, Cargill, Smithfield, and BRF. All 5 of them are leaning into plant-based meat, and 4 of them are leaning into cultivated meat. So JBS bought outright a cultivated meat company, and they're setting up a pilot plant in Sao Paulo. Tyson has invested in 2 cultivated meat companies. Cargill has invested in 2 cultivated meat companies. And BRF has a JV agreement with an Israeli cultivated meat company. We're saying the same thing with the major food companies like Nestle and ADM, really leaning into alternative proteins. And in fact, just last week, ADM announced that they're going to put $300 million into another plant-based processing facility specifically for plant-based meat. So seeing a ton of activity there. And for the meat companies, it just makes sense. Our pitch to the meat companies is like, hey, look, your goal as a meat company is to produce protein profitably. Your goal is not to deal with all of the headaches that come with the external costs of the current system. We have been making meat the same way for 12,000 years. It's time for an update, and you should be on the forefront of that update because who understands meat better than you do? And hey, here's something that you can brag about in your annual sustainability report. So, put a little bit differently, we're challenging them not to be Kodak, to be Canon. So do you see the digital film revolution? This is basically that for meat, and you should lean in. And that's resonating with them, much to their credit, and we're really super happy about that.
Yeah, that's great. You've also been pioneering in the consumer acceptance testing research around this, which is quite a great thing to be giving these companies and startups, and even planning the policy work that you're doing. Can you share some of that?
Yeah, we try to operate as a think tank in the alternative protein space. So every year we release our state of the industry reports, and there are 3 or 4, depending on the year, reports. But we have one on fermentation, which is both biomass and precision fermentation, one on plant-based meat, dairy, and eggs, and one on cultivated meat. And in those, we basically say this is where the world is at in terms of this technology for making food. And we look at the policy situation, we look at the science and technology situation, we look at investor situation, we look at, who are the corporates that are taking this seriously, we look at entrepreneurship and kind of all of that. And we also look at consumer research. Consumer research is tough because revealed preference is oftentimes significantly different from what people actually decide. So we do see ourselves as playing a pretty critically important role in, to some degree, saying, hey, wait a minute, yeah, every January for decades, there are stories out about how people are cutting back on their meat consumption. And most years, you actually see meat consumption go up. So literally every year for more than 20 years, there are these stories about people eating less meat. Every poll for 20 years, people say they are eating less meat. And yet per capita meat consumption, 2019, 2021, highest it has ever been, even where those polls are. Consumers would tell you, there's the famous green bean study from Stanford. If you ask consumers if there are bowls of green beans and one of them is labeled heart healthy, and one of them is labeled, low fat and low calorie, and one of them has no label at all, what would you do in this situation? Most people are going to tell you that it wouldn't matter what the label was. Do they want green beans or not? And yet that's just not true. People eat it less if it's labeled heart healthy. They eat it even less if it's labeled low fat, low calorie. The one thing that gets consumers to tick up from just no label at all is something having to do with it being delicious. So really thinking about what is revealed preference, what do consumers actually do, as opposed to, what do consumers say? And most consumer research is what do consumers say, and then take it at face value. I mean, another fascinating example of this that I think is critically important for how we think about this, there have been a couple of studies not in the food space that I think are pretty telling. One of them was a study where they asked people to rate some genes, some hypothetical genes, on the basis of attractiveness and comfort. And first, they gave people, 6 options. One of the options was produced with child labor. And they asked consumers, which of these 6 options you can know about 4 of them. And basically, nobody wanted to know whether the genes were produced with child labor. And then the second thing that happened was once they just told people, okay, produced with child labor, and people thought the genes were less comfortable and less attractive if they were child labor free, because they thought they were sacrificing. Like, you tell somebody something is more ethical, they think they're sacrificing and they don't want it. The same thing happened with eco-friendly laundry detergent. People thought that if you're getting eco-friendly laundry detergent, it's not going to clean your clothes as well. So there was an interesting study that was done with the Impossible Burger, where they offered people the Impossible Burger and actual burgers at a university. And they told people the Impossible Burger is much, much better for the environment. And they just blanketed the cafeteria with eat the Impossible Burger for the planet. Hypothetically, it seems like that, I don't know, but it'd be interesting to see whether that was the right move or not. When people are at point of sale, they want something that is delicious and filling, not something that saves the planet or that is healthier. Maybe the environmental thing doesn't have the same disincentive as telling them that it's low fat or low calorie, because low fat and low calorie says less filling, less satisfying. But think about the, slave labor makes the jeans less attractive and less comfortable. Environmental friendliness means that the laundry detergent isn't going to clean as well in the eyes of consumers. You could see the environmental messaging. Maybe it was counterproductive. It'd be worth looking at that.
Oh, boy.
So anyway, we see ourselves as sort of actually diving a little bit deeper and taking these kinds of things seriously. I mean, another fascinating example, you ask people, if you looked at a menu and there was a vegetarian section, would you be more likely or less likely to order off the vegetarian section? My hunch is you're going to get something like 95% of people who will say it's irrelevant. I'm going to eat whatever, the thing is on the menu that I'm interested in. More than twice as much sales when you eliminated the vegetarian section and moved it into the general menu. This is a study from the London School of Economics, and they still labeled it vegetarian. So my hypothesis is if they hadn't even put the vegetarian on there, how much more would the sales have gone up? What appears to be true is if you label something vegan or you label it vegetarian, people who aren't vegetarian or vegan, which is 98% of the population, think that's not for me. That's for vegetarians and vegans. So as a vegetarian or vegan, we go into a restaurant, we're super happy that they've got a vegetarian menu. If our goal is actually good things for the environment or animals or whatever reason we're vegetarian, it's probably an order of magnitude counterproductive to have an entire vegetarian menu. It's even, less than half the sales to have a vegetarian section of the menu. And I'd love to see a lot more research like this, but being able to sort of have these conversations and tell people things that are oftentimes counterintuitive that will actually help them with sales, and how to think about these issues. Lean into this is delicious. Don't lean into this is, really anything other than this is delicious.
Yeah, amazing.
The thing that's fascinating to me is the frequency with which people kind of on our side will see, okay, the environmental argument isn't working. The solution to this is to really hit people over the head with the environmental argument. Like, it's not working. We just must not have gotten it right. We need to say it more. They're not hearing us. And I think the opposite of that is true. I think people are hearing us and this just isn't, people don't make food decisions on the basis of the environment.
On the Ezra Klein show in early 2019, you estimated 2 to 5 years until some cultivated meats would be available in grocery stores. What's your updated estimates, and what do you see the path as to getting there?
So I haven't listened to the 2019 interview in a while. I think I said very high-end grocery stores.
Yes.
I hope that's what I said. That's possible in Singapore now. It's in a hotel and a restaurant, including a sort of outdoor stand in Singapore. Based on the conversations that I'm having with cultivated meat companies, there is a lot of expectation that FDA, USDA will approve cultivated meat for sale this year. My hunch is that the same sort of grocery stores that sell, foie gras and other upscale products will probably have a limited amount of cultivated meat. Probably this year or next year would be my prediction. I've certainly downgraded my overall sense of how quickly cultivated meat can come to market, but China's the wild card there. The thing that could radically transform this, I think, is what China does. I mentioned that GFI's global battle cry is to convince governments that they should be funding this, but it's worth looking at what China is doing. China 3 years ago had no wind energy to speak of. Now they have more wind energy than the rest of the world combined in roughly 2.5 years. China has done the same thing for solar prices. So probably most people listening or watching are aware of the fact that solar prices have plummeted faster than any of the experts predicted. That is China. Without China, 0% chance of that happening. There's a similar story to be told about electric vehicles. So China has 93 lithium-ion gigafactories for electric vehicle battery production. The US has 4. Europe has 10. In 8 years, China's going to have 140. The US is going to have 10. Europe is going to have 14. So Tesla, we've never heard of it, if not for China, because the lithium-ion batteries would not be there to supply them. GM, 2035, complete 100% electric vehicles, impossible without the gigafactories in China. Same thing with Ford and their 2035 production in Europe pledge. So one of the things that we're very enthusiastic about is China getting on board with alternative proteins, which could significantly increase the rate at which we get to taste the same or better and cost the same or less across both plant-based meat and cultivated meat. And I will say, this is in all of our offices, the thing that we're saying is, look, the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office and ClimateWorks Foundation, working with Vivid Economics, which is a McKinsey economic analysis think tank, they released in November a report that said in 2050, we're looking at $1.1 trillion in added value to the economy and 9.5 to 9.8 million new jobs from alternative proteins if governments incentivize it. And the question is, will all of those jobs and will all of that added economic value, will that be in China, or will that be in the UK, or will that be in Israel, or will that be in Singapore, or will that be in the United States? And in the United States, our pitch is, look, Joe Biden in his first joint address to Congress is talking about lithium-ion battery production, and he's talking about solar panel production. Those horses have left the stable. Sure, we should do more to produce those things in the United States, but this is lithium-ion battery production. This is solar panel production for food. So the question is not, do we incentivize these technologies or things stay the same? The question is, do we incentivize these technologies, or like solar panels and lithium-ion batteries, do we import all of our meat from the countries that did incentivize these technologies? So if we're able to really make that argument, and if we're able to get governments to put the money that they should be putting into this, for all the reasons it's important: climate change, pandemic risk, antimicrobial disease resistance risk. If we can get governments to put billions of dollars into this, it could accelerate, and we think we will. It can accelerate the technology quite a lot.
Yeah. Is there something specific that you're worried might kind of cause things to cap out, or something that could go wrong? We've seen this with GMO foods in Europe, for example, with the labelling and then the consumer hesitancy around it. Is there anything that you see on the horizon that you're really trying to work against having that similar path?
Yeah, it's been interesting. So GFI now, we have about 75 people in the US. We have about 75 people outside the US. So we have significantly sized, very effective organizations in India, Israel, Brazil, Asia Pacific out of Singapore, and Europe out of both Brussels and London. And this concern was not something that had even really meaningfully occurred to me probably 3 years ago. I really had a sort of, if we build it, they will come mentality. Like, if we can make meat that tastes the same or better and it costs the same or less, and we say, hey, look, doesn't contribute to all these external costs, isn't going to poison you in your kitchen, and unless you treat, you don't have to treat your kitchen like a biohazard lab, isn't going to have the pesticide and the herbicide and the antibiotic residues. Like, this just seemed to me like an argument that almost sells itself. But Europe is just very different. You look at France, you look at Italy, you look at Spain, like there is a sort of culture of not just meat exactly, but like the fact that it's a 12,000-year-old technology is like a plus factor for it in some parts of Europe, and sort of a fear similar to the GMO fear, a fear of just something that is food technology is definitely something that we need to pay attention to in Europe for sure, and probably more attention than I thought we needed to pay to it in terms of consumer adoption in other parts of the world as well. So now I'm looking at taste the same or better and cost the same or less as necessary but not sufficient. But still necessary. Like, without taste the same or better and cost the same or less, this stays niche. Consumers are not going to sacrifice on either of these factors on behalf of any of these external costs. But yeah, I mean, there are a bunch of things that we need to worry about, and especially in Europe, sort of fear of new foods is going to be a big one.
So some people advocate for regenerative agriculture, the idea that happy animals are slaughtered humanely. What do you say to the people who advocate for that as a path to change?
Well, two things. So the overall thesis of GFI is that we need a solution that scales. Like, we're not in Singapore and Israel because we care what people are eating in Singapore and Israel. And in fact, everywhere that we are, like, our complete evaluative standard was, does this government are they likely to incentivize the technologies that we want incentivized? Is this something they care about? And do they have world-class scientific institutions that actually could become centers for excellence in cultivated meat, centers for excellence in plant-based alternatives to industrial animal agriculture, that sort of thing? So Singapore has a government that cares about food security, Israel too. They also care about climate change. They also are big on innovation, and they have world-class universities and very robust entrepreneurial communities. So that's why we're in those places. The thing about regenerative agriculture, which I'm a big fan of, is that the products cost more, and doing regenerative agriculture right requires oversight. So, like, if we turned the entire United States 100% regenerative agriculture, we'd have to convince people to eat a lot less meat. We'd have to convince people to pay a lot more for it. So as a solution that scales and actually solves these problems, it doesn't seem to me, and I haven't heard from anybody in the regenerative community who have a theory for how this becomes the global solution to that 70 to 100% more meat by 2050, most of which is going to happen in developing economies. So that's part one. Part two is it's a complement to what we're doing. So cultivated chicken requires about a fourth the land of conventional chicken. Cultivated beef requires about a 20th of the land of animal-based beef, even less if you're talking about regenerative agriculture. To the degree that regenerative agriculture actually restores soils and allows ranches to be turned into places where carbon sequestration happens, what we're doing can be a complement to that because it requires so much land, decreases prices for land, and you can expand your regenerative ranching. You can expand your heritage breed animal production. And right now, that is a vanishingly small percentage of the industry. But in a world where people are paying more attention to food, the people who want the sort of cycle of life, the people who think the 12,000-year-old technology, like, in France and Spain and Italy, like people for whom that is like a legit value that they're willing to pay more for, I think that actually goes up in our scenario. What we move toward lessening and eliminating is industrial animal agriculture, which causes all of these harms. So our hope is that they would see what we're doing as a complement, and then also just like sort of thinking about it on a grand scale. If we're trying to solve these really big global problems, it seems like alternative proteins does that in a way that regenerative agriculture is going to like move in that direction a lot more slowly.
Okay, so a bit of a selfish question for me personally. I'm ethically vegan and have been for a long time, but practically vegetarian because cheese seems to be such a barrier, not just for me, but also the people in my life who want to be able to cater for me. You made a joke earlier about the burnt down vegan restaurant. What's left is, well, the cheese still hasn't melted. What is the path that you see for good cheese options?
Yeah, that is such a fascinating question. I mean, I will say that like one of the key things about GFI is that we work very hard to dissociate ourselves from the telling people what to do side of like sort of food and diet. And I think a big part of, you earlier asked about barriers. Like one of our barriers is that people associate us. I think they may have like sort of PTSD around some angry vegan in the past. And we're sort of associated with the you should go vegan or you're immoral crowd. So the thing that we keep saying is we don't care what people eat. We don't care what you eat. We agree with Tyson and Nestle that consumers should drive this. And so we're, analogizing to renewable energy and electric vehicles. We're not the people saying, buy a Tesla, put solar panels on your car. We're the people trying to make solar and electric vehicles simply how the world is powered and how people get around. So to food, we're not telling people to give up cheese. We're not telling people to give up meat. We're trying to make the products that can compete in the marketplace by tasting the same or better and costing the same or less. And to your question, our focus is pretty single-mindedly on meat. There's just an overwhelming amount to do on cultivated meat, an overwhelming amount to do on plant-based meat, an overwhelming amount to do on biomass fermentation. I mean, it's kind of fascinating to think. In the history of the world, there's been one product that in a legit taste test satisfied meat eaters. So about 2 years ago, there was a professionally done taste test, and they did burgers and chicken. And the chicken that like you and I as vegans take to our family and say, oh my God, this chicken is amazing, didn't get above 0.7 on a 1-point scale. On the burgers, the Impossible Burger got to 1.02, but nothing else got really that close to 1.0, which was the actual animal burger, and 1.0 was the actual animal chicken. So we're at least 2 or 3 years away from a plant-based product that tastes the same or better and costs the same or less. It'll probably be a burger. And that's, beyond meat's estimate. So that might even be a little aggressive, a little optimistic. On cultivated meat, 10 years away from a cost-competitive cultivated meat burger, assuming that governments really get on board with making this happen, which we're optimistic about that. So, and it could, as I noted, it could happen a lot more quickly if China gets on board. And that is a long-winded way of saying we have funded about $13 million in open access science so far. We're working on policy to convince governments to set up things like centers for cellular agriculture and plant-based meat and that sort of thing. We're really focused on the meat part. So our corporate engagement department does quite a bit on the full range of products because that's kind of the expectation of a corporate engagement think tank on these issues. But our science is really focused on meat. Our lobbying activity is really focused on meat. We do some stuff on like dairy and eggs and labeling, but in part that's because the decisions made on dairy and eggs on labeling are going to have implications for meat on labeling. So we're really in the sort of Jim Collins hedgehog concept. We go deep rather than going broad. I will say though, it's my impression that there are a lot of people making a lot of progress. I do think a lot of the plant-based cheeses are really quite good. There's some really exciting stuff happening in precision fermentation. So there's literally a company that is taking soy plants and growing dairy proteins in the soy plants. And so you process a soy milk, and the soy milk has actual dairy proteins, but that didn't require any cows. So has all of the sort of benefits of this way of producing, and turning that into cheese, which could be a little ways off and probably will be expensive for a while. But I would be very optimistic about that, being fully satisfying. I don't consider myself to be an expert in this, and I get a little bit surprised by the number of people who are saying we are there. And they're like, this is the one that does it. this is the one that does it, whether it's precision fermentation or plant-based. But then I remember that like every plant-based meat pitch deck claims they're the next Impossible Foods. And most of them say we're going to have products in the next 6 months. And it took 5 years for one of the top scientists in the world, Pat Brown, to have a product. So I think there's a lot of puffery. I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful as somebody who is a vegan and would like to have vegan cheese that approximates the real thing, as somebody who cares about all of the external costs of the dairy industry, including animal suffering. I would love to see that happen as quickly as possible, but it is not a significant focus for GFI right now.
For the people who are listening and watching to this, what are the asks that you'd have for them? If you wanted them to take action, what would that be?
Well, I have had so many amazing conversations at this EA conference. I chatted with a woman who is a pandemic researcher. I am really leaning in right now, and GFI is leaning in to elevating alternative proteins as a climate solution and going to the climate funder community and the climate NGO community and the climate policymaking community and saying, look, the IPCC acknowledges what is true on our current trajectory of meat consumption. We simply cannot meet Paris Agreement obligations, and nobody else has a theory. There is no plan B other than alternative proteins for turning back the clock on that. There are similar arguments to be made with pandemic risk and AMR and global poverty relief, just the inefficiency driving up prices. So for people who are, as this woman I was chatting with, she's getting her PhD and she's focused on pandemics. So my challenge to her was, wow, you can be the thought leader in this. You can publish papers about this. So we've got Preventing the Next Pandemic from July 2020. It's a scientific consensus. Like that's a consensus paper from scientists at the United Nations Environment Program pulled together. But nobody's talking about it. There aren't any peer review studies that are making the point that they all came together and agreed on. So she can go and do that. I had another conversation with somebody who's working in global poverty relief, and she said, hey, I want to come work in alternative proteins. And I said, no. Don't come work in alternative proteins, stay in global poverty relief, and point out that 100 million metric tons of corn and soy turned into biofuels is called a human rights crime by the Global Envoy on Food at the United Nations, more than 10 times as much as fed to farm animals. Make this connection, publish literature in peer-reviewed environmental journals about this point, and raise this as a policy issue of concern for people in the global poverty hunger relief communities. Same thing could be said about antimicrobial resistance. So depending on what people are doing, I would challenge people to ask the counterfactual impact of your choice. So if you are interested in alternative proteins as a way to solve these problems, you could come work at one of these companies. That's the most common thing to do. You will be filling a job that somebody else would have filled, maybe a little better than you, maybe a little worse than you. But if you're currently working in global poverty relief or antimicrobial resistance or somewhere else in global health or one of these other areas, stay there and elevate this issue. And there are lots of similar examples. For people who are college students or thinking about what they want to focus on, tissue engineering, synthetic biology, biotechnology, food science, meat science, for that matter. Go be a meat scientist and help the entire meat industry recognize that this is a new and better way of producing meat. So there are lots of things for people to do. GFI has a slate of different newsletters, including our monthly reports that folks can sign up for at gfi.org/newsletters. Very creative. We also have lots of webinars. We have a massive open online course. We have our Alt Protein project, which is currently on 16 universities around the world, about to be 32. We've created just basically plug and play university resources for people who are not at a university where we have an alt protein project. It's a pretty competitive process to get all of the resources that we bring to the table if you are an actual alt protein project chapter, but we have lots of resources for raising these issues on your campuses for college students. So lots of other ideas, but that's a start.
Thank you so much for joining us. It was really fascinating hearing about the work that GFI is doing and the ways that people can support it.
That's very kind of you, Luke. I'm a huge fan of you and your work and really honored that you invited me to sit down for this chat.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.